My name is Carla Person. I'm a professor in the School of Law, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to have this wonderful guest, who's not really a guest, actually. I think in a way, you're a friend. You're part of Essex, part of the Essex community. I, Kihara-Hunt, did her PhD here with Françoise Hampson. What was the topic?
Accountability of peacekeepers.
Okay, so right on point. And in fact, a number of years ago, we were in contact because I had written on that subject, and I'm glad to finally have the opportunity to meet with you and to see you here. Kihara-Hunt has an amazing background, and she is professor at the graduate program on human security and director of the Research Center for Sustainable Peace and director of International Law Training and Research Hub at the University of Tokyo. And she also serves as a member in the expert study group on the future of peace operations for the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial 2025. And that, I think, is going to be the main focus of your comments today. Her main area of research is UN peace operations, in particular UN police, accountability, and human rights. And she teaches in a variety of subject areas related to international criminal law, international humanitarian law, human security, and peace building. And Professor Kihara-Hunt has worked extensively in peacekeeping operations with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and with other UN offices in a whole array of countries for about a 10-year, actually almost 20-year period. So I'm sure that will also give further flavor to your comments today. So today, the talk will focus on the evolving landscape of UN peace operations in the face of emerging global threats and challenges. I think there's a range of questions that the topic raises. I certainly have a whole list of questions, so I'm really excited to hand over to you. So welcome once again. Speak for us 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions at the end. We are taping this session. If anyone has issue with any of the questions at the end being taped, please just let us know and we'll be sure to edit them out. And that's all for now. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for raising expectations. But yeah, thank you very much for welcoming me. Okay, so first point I have to make is that I'm making this in my personal capacity, even though she mentioned that I'm part of the study group. And the second caveat I would have to mention is that I'm normally in accountability and like more on the individual conduct type accountability of peacekeepers, especially UN police, and also like sexual exploitation, abuse. I am called in to do a more of a general assessment of UN peace operations and looking for future, finding the future for UN peace operations. So I think that's where I'm coming from. So if there's anything that you think, oh, this is missing, then please do let me know, because it's not probably not intentional. So yeah, if you could go to actually, it's not table of content. I started writing a table of content, but it didn't end up with a table of content. I started thinking about, okay, what do I talk about this? What is UN peace operations? And because there are many different ways to define UN peace operations. In previous research, I used the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations list, just so that it's easy to follow and no other inclusion or exclusion of it. But thinking about this, the success of UN peace operations, I got to the stage that it is a little bit difficult to just say, okay, I'm just going to follow the list of Department of Peacekeeping Operations. This was the starting point for UN peace operations for me. That is mostly established by the Security Council, but not necessarily, because there are some that are established by General Assembly resolution, and that might be one of the ways in the future. So I don't want to exclude that. This is the element that is necessary. That is that it's either carried out by the UN itself or authorized by UN and carried out by authorized entities. I say entities because I'm not excluding any others but regional organizations, because I think you may think about regional organizations first, but maybe there are other possibilities. And then there has to be some kind of focus on the mandate, because there are many other initiatives that the UN takes. So the primary purpose of this peace operations being related to peace and security target, that's something that I want to focus and then try to exclude some others. And generally governed by the Department of Peace Operations, but this is not a factor to exclude other missions. So that's where I started from. And if you can go to the next one, I can also go to the next one. Okay. I go to the next one. Not okay. I hope yes. So starting from the Department's peacekeeping operations map, then you get to the very familiar map of most of the things in Africa, on the African continent, and in the Middle Eastern area, Middle East, with a very long-standing missions, and then one in Cyprus, and that's what you would normally see when you look for peacekeeping operations map. This one is guided by, and I think we are coming back to that principles quite a lot, by three principles, as you know, the consent of the parties, consent of the state and or parties, impartiality, and non-use of force except for self-defense. Of course, this notion of self-defense has expanded, so it's not only your self-defense, but self-defense of the mandate, and also in some occasions, this is kind of including, it doesn't exclude protection of other people, like civilians, host state civilians. So I think looking even with this thing and past operation that I'm not going to talk about too much, the strength of UN peace operations is the flexibility and the flexible, adaptable mandate making and deploying relatively rapidly to the place for peace and security issues. And then there is a question, and I'm sure you have different opinions, varying opinions, of the strength of not being involved in the use of force themselves. So I think this was the starting point for my map. But then if you can go to the next one, I don't think we can exclude the other types of missions, like special political missions and other political presences. And this is governed by another department in UN that is political affairs. Now it's conflict prevention, peacemaking, post-conflict peace building. These ones, at least special political missions, have very, very similar mandates, depending on which one you are looking at. I was involved in UN in Nepal with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, working alongside with UN mission in Nepal. And UN mission in Nepal was a political mission, so it's not a peacekeeping operation, but they were involved in very similar tasks as peacekeeping operations. For example, DDR, taking weapons away from the people who were involved in conflict. They were the ones that were actually taking the weapons away and storing it and 24 hours monitoring it. And I don't see why we have to exclude these from the landscape of peace operations. So I think with the first sort of a purpose statement that I had, like peace and security, largely for largely for maintaining or to some extent building peace and security, with some, I think it's probably the next slide that no, not yet. Oh, okay, sorry. With some uniformed personnel component. I think that's generally what I'm looking at now. That still doesn't cut very nicely which one is included and which one is not included. But then if you see the mandates and tasks, and this one was very difficult to compile, so I just, for this one, I followed the Oxford Handbook on the United Nations Peacekeeping Operations, like a big handbook, to see what kind of mandates, what kind of tasks those operations have been involved in. And this one mostly include peacekeeping operations. And then I want to see how close that is to other types of missions. So I think the famous ones and the most traditional ones is monitoring operations, right? So you are very familiar with UN peacekeeping operations in a very traditional sense, that they are looking at, they are monitoring a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement. And then a little bit further than, a little bit different, I see a little bit different from that type of monitoring is monitoring of human rights or violation of international humanitarian law, because that one actually includes civilians looking at the human rights officers or sometimes political officers or sometimes part of the judicial part that are looking at the compliance with the human rights standards or international human rights law or international humanitarian law. That is going in a little bit more into the, into the substance, not substance. It's not only according to the ceasefire agreement or peace agreement. So I see it a little bit more, in a way, intrusive. Election monitoring security, they have done it many times. It used to be an exit strategy for peacekeeping operations for the UN. Now it seems to be not working so well, looking at, for example, Cambodia, maybe. There are a lot of missions that were involved in DDR for disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. Part of the DDR may be seen as part of SSR, security sector reform, but yeah, security sector reform can be wider. Okay. There are security sector reform and sometimes not, some things that are not amounting to reform, like the security sector assistance, maybe. So that different levels of SSR have been conducted by UN peace operations. Law enforcement, I put law enforcement as in law enforcement conducted by the mission personnel itself, like UN police themselves or corrections. Capacity building, there are a lot of capacity building activities targeting different audiences. Preventive deployment, I'm talking about monitoring so that the violence doesn't escalate. For example, in UNPREDEP in the former Yugoslavia. Transitional administration, of course, the most the biggest one is in Kosovo and East Timor, but there were predecessors for that. Assistance to transition is not fully in control of the administration, but assisting the national governance body to transit. Multidimensional mission is the one that you may be most interested in, because now people say that is failing. But multidimensional missions can be called in different ways, and they are like, for example, peace support operations. Like Europeans like to call it more like peace support operations. It's generally a lot of tasks, so that is a long-lasting structure for peace. And then mine action, we are coming we coming back to this like mine action, explosives removals and awareness raising, and that kind of actions also being quite successfully done by UN peace operations in the past. Humanitarian assistance itself is not very original mandate, but they do humanitarian assistance themselves and also support to humanitarian assistance, like escorting humanitarian convoys, etc. So that's also been done. Refugee, IDP, displacement assistance in that area in collaboration with UNHCR, for example, they have done in multiple missions. And then economic recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction has also been part of it. Support for international criminal justice. I think you are very familiar with assistance to Taylor in Liberia. Protection of civilians. I mean, protection, I put it in a big bundle. There are many different targets for protection of civilians, but also targeted protection of like conflict related sexual violence or children or women. Reconciliation assistance. And I put this differently from transitional justice, but reconciliation assistance was more to facilitate the talk so that they get into agreement of what happens afterwards. Good governance type, it's a lot of small things that I tried to put together to work on good governance of the local host government. Judicial reform, legal reform, women's participation, that was one mission that picked up. And cultural preservation, this was from Mali, that had a particular mention to preserving, protecting cultural sites. So you can see like a range, like it's like almost like a la carte menu of peace operations in United Nations. And I think when you see media reports, I think you will see a lot of, okay, this is not working. And as an academic, I do that also as well. But then we were trying to revisit what they have been doing and to see if something has actually worked. Yeah, so if you can go to the next slide, I think I'm slightly confused with the order of the slide. So I think we are coming to this kind of picture of peace operations with uniformed personnel, inclusive of those mandates that I talked about, many different mandates, including very robust ones, peace enforcement also, what is called stabilization, which seems to be not working too well, and partnership missions, missions that are partnering with regional organizations or coalition of states, and then looking at personnel of military, police, and civilians. Because of the focus of what I'm doing, I'm interested in missions with uniformed personnel and not necessarily like a special envoy with just civilians, or investigative bodies that were established by DPP, Department of Political Affairs, DPPA. But I think you can kind of feel the scope that I'm looking at. So yeah, if you can move to the next one. I think many of you are probably already quite familiar, but I thought, and I'm sure you cannot see the small letters. I think it is necessary to kind of highlight who are sending uniformed personnel. So generally speaking, I started my research in like 15 years ago. And at that time, I was saying South Asian countries and African countries. I think the order has switched a little bit. So African countries and South Asian countries are the major contributing countries to send uniformed personnel. Okay, so I think that's the scene set. Yeah, I think the next one. And this has been reviewed so many times recently because of failures and perceived failures. HIPPO is the one with a high level panel on peace operations, which looked at peacekeeping operations and other peace operations. So I think the scope is similar to mine, not necessarily the same, but similar to mine. Agenda for peace and new agenda for peace. So tackling with new agenda for peace as well, what they have said and what that means actually. And the upcoming summit for the future, there are many submissions by different parties to the summit of the future to seek recommendations. So, okay, if you can go to the next one. And so to make it more sort of focused, I tackling quite a lot with the buzzwords. So one is a networked multilateralism, whatever that means. So networked multilateralism meaning having friends of states to support peace operations, but peace and security in general, but to not to compete against each other, but to have a new and or existing and new networks to nurture, to find possibilities of keeping multilateralism and to possibly encouraging it further. Next one is the difficult one, and it's all these terms that we then like to use: nimble, agile, adaptive, flexible, and versatile. What it means is quite open still. In the committee that is supporting peace operations, C34, they have repeatedly used this word, like nimble. It has to be nimble, it has to be agile, it has to be adaptive and flexible and versatile. So we're trying to flesh out what that means. It seems to come to a few things that I will talk about a little bit later, but for example, budgeting or personnel or partnering or the more rapid deployment of people, flexible thinking, out of the box, securing that this will happen if there is an idea of peace operations, and flexibility also during a mission. So the peace operations are normally established by Security Council, and after that they get renewed. But oftentimes it's very difficult to change the mandate. So the focus is also on changing the mandate or making the operation workable when the situation on the ground change. People-centered, I have not much idea yet what this actually means, but it seems operationally speaking, it's quite related to having people on the ground and listening to the people on the ground, which is nothing new, but having a rapport with the community, having the means to communicate with them and to respond to them. So in my head, it's more like a client orientation. And then adaptation. So adaptation is related to this adaptiveness, but now there is recognition that maybe having one mandate and just assuming that will continue does not work. So there is a talk about staged mandating. So let's get the Security Council or whoever will create the mandate and then have a second stage, like second step, or maybe third step to make it operational. So yeah, that's the buzzwords. And then on been thinking a lot about, is the UN peace operations a success or failure? And my conclusion, I'm starting with the conclusion. I think the success or failure is really depending on what the peace operations are for. because there are many failures, and I've been tackling a lot about accountability of peace operations, and especially individual accountability of peace operations. There are many failures that were patched and are still to be patched. But depending on what you look at, I mean, we went through a lot of academic writings about who says what about peace operations. And I think the first point was to try to see what the strengths are of UN peace operations. For me, the biggest strength of UN peace operations is the flexibility to respond to crisis and to the needs from the birth of peace operations, because it didn't exist in the UN Charter, but it's existed because of the needs. And then, you know, they have even started a mission with a General Assembly resolution when Russia was not there. And then I think there are also partnerships that were newly sought, and I think you will probably think about African Union. But of course, like Kosovo, there was a good sort of parallel peace operations with Europe. So I think the strength is the flexibility, and it's very much because the UN is a monster, a big entity, and this peace and security is governed by the Security Council, which, as you know, has a lot of problems. Even with that obstacles, and I share the pessimism that the Security Council is not working, but even with that, they try to find something to do. And in the past, they have managed to do. In the past, also they have failed in some massive crisis also. But I think there is some strength of that sort of flexibility and the mindset. I think the UN as such is more designed to have a sort of bureaucratic, organized way of dealing with things. But peace and security area, especially peace operations, I think has been flexible relatively to respond to the needs. So that's one kind of strength that I want to think about how to use that to make it better, if we have to make it better. Another thing is a decentralization. So in peace operations, unlike other UN entities, actually some entities are quite decentralized, but they have come quite a lot forward in decentralizing decision making. So even, for example, having, deciding how many people should be deployed, or what kind of people should be deployed, or how much money they need, and those kind of things are very central to the UN. But that is driven by the missions now, unlike 10 years ago. So I think there is at least in the operation, in peace operations, and in the headquarters as well, and member states, I guess, there is a will to admit this decentralization is necessary, and it is realized to some extent. And then there is a thing about responding and preventing. At the moment, peace operations are better at responding to crisis, as you know, not so much in preventing crisis. But I think we cannot forget about this monitoring function that, this very, very traditional function of monitoring that they do on a peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, human rights monitoring, which is a little bit of a different category. But that has a very preventive sort of role in and preventing new violence, but also escalating violence or the spread of violence. So I think that we need to actually think about that before sort of signing off. This doesn't work. And then I think more and more, I think legitimacy is actually a big big advantage of the UN. And here, then I will come back later on about the human rights values, or like a good governance values. If the legitimacy comes from the values that member states share, supposedly, then this need to be kept We cannot, let like host states bargain. Okay, well, we like a ceasefire monitoring, but we don't like human rights monitoring. It's at the idea level, I don't think we can bargain. At the operational level, I know that it happens. I mean, it's a operation that the host state will say yes or no, and if the host state says no, then unless it's a peace enforcement, you cannot go in. So I think the legitimacy common values part, we need to be very careful not to lose it to the to like grade down the validity of it. And then on deployment, I've been looking at how slow they are to deploy people, especially civilians, and then police also, matching the skills that they need, and the people who are deployed are not always the same. But now I'm trying to look at it in comparison to others and to see what others are there and how to respond. I think it is getting better, the deployment, rapid deployment, and also the deployment across sectors. So it's easy for a country to send, for example, military. For Japan, it's not, but for some countries, it's easier to send military troops, but not so much civilian expertise or police or corrections, judicial personnel. But UN has a network and the legitimacy to gather those people rapidly, relatively, to deploy. So I think that is a factor that we have to think about. The budget that is already there, which is very, very small, but at least some part is assessed contribution, which means that it's there. And then the visibility and proximity. So they are, if people are deployed actually into the community, they are visible to the community, but also internationally, they are very visible. And they are close to the community that they serve. That is a good thing, unless they do something wrong. Okay, so then I think I try to think about, okay, this is not my my nature to look at the general, generally praising the UN for doing great work. So, but I was trying to see, okay, I have to think what they have done well. So this is, I think, self-criticism. This is a comparison between if there's a UN or if there's no UN. So I'm not saying that this is the best. But it seems that the first research that they used is actually research that uses other people's research to compile like general assessment of UN peace operations. And generally, those academics who are writing about general effect of UN peace operations, they see the reduction of civilian killing or reduction of the spread of violence, and peace agreements having a little more chance than not having the UN, and maintenance of peace and after the conflict. So I think we do need to, I am trying to put myself back to that point to think about, okay, what is said, what is good about what they have done, to be fair. And then to the next one. And then maybe you will say, yeah, but what about MINUSMA in Mali, which is generally considered to be a big failure, because the UN basically had to pull out immediately when the host state said, no, we don't want you, and leaving the country without proper exit strategy. And yeah, generally speaking, that is considered to cited as bad example. But I've been reading people's writings, and this person who was the special representative was had an article about how partly MINUSMA was success, and I think it is quite it is quite unfortunate if we just say, okay, let's sign off MINUSMA type because it didn't work, because there was a massively difficult political condition globally and regionally. And there was, it seems that there was interest on the host state side to have a campaign against the UN and the resources that they had, which is, I think there are lots of details, but not enough, but also with many caveats that national units would say, okay, we are not doing this because it's too dangerous. We will go to this area, but not this area. So I think it is quite difficult just to say, okay, that was a failure. We learn, I think, from the lesson on what would not work, but not necessarily to sign up everything. Okay, then specific areas. This is more about sort of issues area that has been highlighted. So one is protection of civilians. I think you are quite familiar with the failure of protection of civilians in South Sudan or in Mali or DRC, Darfur. I think that is, yeah, there is a big discussion about what, to what extent we continue this POC or protection mandate. But there is a specific area that is heavily criticized. Police, I've been following police quite carefully, and in 2016, the police external review was basically saying, well, UN police, if it works in this way, then it just doesn't work. So it has to change the operational, like whole idea of operation. So they are now changing to more sort of specific special police teams, specialized police teams, SPTs. Human rights due diligence policy. I think you may be aware of this problem at the DRC of working with the host state military and raising human rights concerns. This continues to be an issue, especially for those those military troops that are deployed inside, because on one hand they have to, they have to keep the host state consent, and then to keep the host state happy enough to keep the peace operations in, but at the same time they are they have to make sure that human rights due diligence policy is strictly observed. And there were some of the talks we had was highlighting the difficulty of capacity building at one point, and then the next day you have to like say, okay, well, we're not working anymore. So I think there need to be some kind of some kind of a way to do it. At the moment, it seems that it is quite. I think there are a few problems. The number one, human rights standards are not shared by all the people who are participating in peace operations. Secondly, the host state doesn't share it. And thirdly, at the operational level, they are mandated to do different things at the same time, by the same troops doing different things at the same time. So yeah, I think that's a continuous area. Individual accountability, I've been following very closely, but it has improved quite a lot. Of course, problems remain. Incidents and events, I think that's the most famous part of like failure of things. Failure of protection, misconduct, and also environment, like in a Haiti case. So I think there are negative parts, a lot of negative parts. One issue, one sort of theme that I kind of picked up is accountability of peace operations. So thinking about accountability in a sort of wide range of ways, there is accountability. When I say accountability, instinctively I'm talking about a misconduct type of individual accountability, but more widely accountability of peace operations, accountability to the host state, accountability to the host state, who are host states, so host population, accountability to member states for actually delivering what this peace operation are tasked, accountability of peacekeepers, this is individual, individual and mandate delivery. Increasingly, there are increasingly, I'm not sure if it increasingly visibly, I guess, there are issues of peacekeepers not delivering mandates that are becoming problems. And then I think for many of these accountability issues, it's yes, it is a issue of the rules and implementation, but it's also about communicating it, like the communication with the host community, the member states, peacekeepers, troop and police contributing countries, and the UN, to make transparency, make the strategic messages across, and to respond to their needs or their demands, not all demands, but to actually have a two-way communication. That's something that I'm coming to operationally. And then maybe new challenges. So in new agenda for peace, these are the 6 threats that they highlighted. So changing character of armed conflict, violence outside armed conflict, weaponizing new and emerging technologies, inequalities among nations, shrinking space for civil participation, climate emergency. I've been thinking about new challenges, and I think it's more also about urban and more complex violence. This actually came from the police retreat document that is a public document. That the violence is very mixed with migration and organized crimes and maybe climate change and maybe unemployment and inequality, and it's happening in the same sort of space. It's more complex, and that is not something that is manageable by traditional way of putting troops in to just flatten the violence, but it needs more of an engagement with the community to actually see what's happening, and to actually, it has to be very it has to be a long-term thing and based on communication. There are some others, for example, natural disasters, public health, that are new-ish threat for this case. And mis and disinformation, hate speech, sort of information, playing with information. That's another thing that has been highlighted, and I think we should put that in the new thread. Okay, I know that's 40 minutes. Okay, well, like 3 slides to go. Now coming to the key. So I think the key for having a future for UN peace operations is the trust. So I put it in a very big block of trust. Oftentimes trust is discussed with in the context of host government and the UN because of MINUSMA experience of having to pull out now in Congo, maybe Haiti. But it's a little bit more than that, because if you look at like MINUSMA's case, there were information about the communities that were happy with the UN operations because of the mandate that they delivered, keeping the violence down and having a rapport with the community. That I think is a key that is not necessarily picked up. Oftentimes they were on the state. So host government, host communities, but also with member states. So they need to know what they're doing, and also they need to know what's happening in the mission. And the member states' distrust to UN peace operations as such, or the UN, is largely problematic. In that, I think there need to be a balanced consideration for troop and the police contributing countries. Because UN tends to think, okay, if we upset the TCCs or PCCs, maybe we will not get any more contributions. I think it needs to be a bit more balanced. If, for example, TCCs come without equipment that is necessary, that they signed up for, then we cannot really continue that, because that means that the same number of people will not deliver the mandate. So I think the sort of trust need to be built among all those partners, but all these actors, with the communication and balancing of these things. Host state consent, I think one issue that comes up is the continuous consent. So, host state consent and whose consent, in an armed conflict, ideally all parties, but in Congo, for example, you cannot expect to have all conflict parties to agree. So whose consent, like strategically deciding, okay, whose consent do we need to actually have an operation? We need to tackle pushback to human rights quite carefully. Carefully, I mean, you have to be persistent, and cannot be seen as bargaining, being open to bargaining. Okay, we are ready to drop human rights. But then it has to be communicated to the operational side. And then, yeah, I haven't quite figured out a way of the link between peace building and this sustaining peace type of thing. We often talk about transition, but it's not necessarily transition. And this one I'm still in, thinking. So when we were thinking about it, we thought about alternatives. And of course, I think you may know about the Security Council Resolution 2719, which authorized UN to fund AU missions, African Union missions, and then some people, academics even say, okay, now we just give money to AU and all the problems are solved because it's African problem. I think now that's why I'm also looking at AU operations and the institutional setting and how they are doing, and the rules and regulations and in the AU, which is much more difficult to find out actually than the UN. Without just saying, okay, this is done, we need to look at how they would be able to do. Coalition of states, I think that's quite close to this new model of this MMS, a multinational mission in Haiti, which is really struggling to establish, Kenya is trying to send the police-oriented mission. It's been quite a long time, and now they have the first batch, but it's been quite difficult. And I think that highlights the rapid deployment with the budget that is already given in the UN. Sorry, I see that time. Okay, so possible improvements. I think one part is legitimacy, accountability, building trust, and I don't think we should really give up on this one. And then the next one I think is really important. It's need to be clear and focused and prioritized mandate, because otherwise, if we have so many, expectation is very high, very multi-dimensional missions, with the budget that is, normally we say New York Fire Department, right? The budget, it's not going to succeed. And if the population thinks that they are going to solve all the problems, it cannot. So I think it need to be a clear, focused purpose and a mandate that is communicated, that is clearly communicated to the member states and the host state and host population. That is a key. And then prevention, we've been talking a lot about prevention, but we have to operationalize it. Who do we need? What does it mean for money? So that's one thing. And then planning of a contingency planning. So one thing that really convinced me was that, okay, in this political climate and in this type of violence, some missions are going to fail. Well, at least some part of the mission is going to fail. We need to have a plan for that. And we need to have the expectation management for that. Not to just say, okay, this failed, so we're not going to do it. And that need to be communicated with a sort of one well thought message to the world, but also to the host population, to the TCC, PCC, and contributing countries, and Then I think the means of communication at the moment, UN is very good at online things, but they also need to think further about other types of engagement. Probably offline, more offline. Technology is being talked about a lot, but I see it as in a second, or in the last slide, I will say, but I see, yes, technology is an enabler, but oftentimes I end up seeing a people problem more than a technology problem. Then personnel, of course, I think this has been said many times, right? That people need to be selected properly, trained properly, and caveat need to be properly thought about, and they need to be ready to be deployed as soon as they need to be rapidly deployed. Police need to be more on the specialized police tasks, which they are doing quite well. Risk taking, I think I talked about it, and organizational culture of the UN and member states to think a little bit out of the box, to go over this division of peacekeeping and peace building, or this budget is for this one, or police will only come in this form, or there are a lot of expertise in-house and outside that I think need to be explored. So I think that's mainly what I can say for now. And yeah, thank you for listening. And I will.
Thank you so much. What a great overview. We have about 40 minutes for questions, for comments, for discussion. And let's start with Platin.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Platin Goshen. I'm President Head of Department of Government. So my comment and question actually comes not from my own work, but the work of my colleagues who specialize on peacekeeping operations. My colleague, Princess Mary Gisela, has just got this large grant, HRC grant, to looking at peace dividends of peacekeeping operations. And what struck me is when you were talking about success and failure, like I wanted a little bit more information about what do we mean by success and failures, because the way she talks about peace dividends, right, her project, is she divides it into different types of activities. And her preliminary findings, she'll probably kill me by saying it's not yet real, but her preliminary findings is that certain type of activities, you actually see a positive effect. So if you're only looking at what we're calling the negative piece, right, the violence and all that, then you're missing the maternal health, the education, the elections, all these other types of activities. So her work, that's why it's peace dividends, is dividing it up to other factors that impact peace and what role peacekeeping operations could be playing into that. So this is why I was wondering, what did you mean by success and failure, given how she defines it?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think okay, so if I'm speaking on my personal capacity, then I'm very much interested in like root causes and the equality. I mean, I think she introduced me, but I was a human rights officer, so I'm very much interested in that sort of sustaining peace, more sort of inclusive definition of peace. If I'm talking more for the peace, can I speak on peacekeeping ministerial type, then it's much more of a negative piece about the violence itself, about recurrence of armed conflict. I mean, occurrence and recurrence of armed conflict and physical violence. Yeah. So yes, it is very much undefined, and yeah, I see. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a 3 o'clock meeting.
Yeah.
for coming.
Thank you.
Maybe I can ask a question before we move to who has questions up on the floor. If you think about which countries were involved in peacekeeping operations, let's say 20 years ago, and who is involved now, we see a bit of an evolution in who was involved. And you have a number of states like United States, Canada, France, who in the last decade or so have chosen to be involved not in UN peacekeeping operations, but in NATO operations or in these multidimensional operations, like France I'm thinking France in Congo, Central African Republic, and Mali.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you see that evolution in terms of the overall support and global mandate of these peacekeeping operations, as well as the accountability.
Yeah. It's a difficult and good question. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think there are a few things. What can I say, right? Yeah, a few things. So one, I think in relation to the pushback to, like, for example, more liberal type peace operations or more liberal type interventions, there is a part that, like the UN having operations is has a different kind of meaning to the community, to the world as well, I guess, but more to the host community, host state and host community, in comparison to France or NATO. That's one thing. I think for the accountability, I was last multidimensional operations by multidimensional operations or coalition approach. For accountability, it's I mean, I can talk a lot about individual accountability, but became so complex because of all these different actors, and different actors have different rules and regulations, and well, it doesn't have to be the conduct, or it can also be about the rule of engagement, or the law that they are bound by. So the accountability side is definitely more complex. I think evolution, what else can I say? Yeah.
We can leave it there for now, but
Yeah. No, there's a lot that there's
for ongoing discussion.
yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Sorry, online?
Yeah, do you?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. If they can speak directly, if you can give them access. I don't know if you can. If not, if you can read it out.
Bear with me, let me just quickly.
Welcome, Jeff.
Oh.
So I'm hoping.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, excellent. Right. Thanks, I, for your inspiring views on peacekeeping going forward. But going back to your map right at the beginning, there are a lot of peacekeeping operations in neighbouring states in Africa. How far do the different mandates across national frontiers inhibit regional peace? Thanks.
How far the neighboring countries doing it?
Can you, Jeff, can you just repeat quickly your question? Well, I think we missed a few words.
Okay, try again. Going back to the map that's at the beginning, there are a lot of peacekeeping operations in neighbouring states in Africa. How far do the different national mandates that apply in those different countries inhibit a regional peace process?
National mandates of peace operation, or national mandates of.
So I'm trying to get the idea that each country will have a mandate laid down by Security Council, and that might be specific to one country. There'll be a neighboring country that has a different mandate for its peacekeeping operation. Does the fact that the armed groups in question very rarely stick to just one country inhibit a regional peace process?
I think I think they're positive and negative. Okay, so I think they are also on top of what you mentioned. There is an element that most of the countries that are deploying military or police are from the neighboring country as well. So it's basically like a regional activities authorized by the UN kind of and increasingly they are tackling like transnational organized crimes or like migration or those things that are that have a transnational activity or influence. But of course there are let me see. Yeah, for example, for the case of like DRC, of course, there are some problems with looking at DRC and not the neighboring countries because the mandate doesn't go over the border. So how does so how do I compare that with what is the influence on the regional piece? Yeah, I guess one is that it doesn't effectively stop because it's not the peace operations originally is not designed to look over the border. Now they have cross country. They are looking at the influence across the border, for example, looking at migration or looking at trafficking or looking at organized crimes, but of course they cannot go to the next country to do that. So yeah, how is the influence? Limited influence, I guess, but there is influence, I think. Well, maybe that's also somewhere that the partnership comes in as well. That some of those regional trend or regional peace and security issues cannot be only tackled by UN peace operations, but it has to be in a context of the regional peace. So maybe that's something I can say. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question.
But many thanks. It's a complex topic, and it's good that there are things going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a study that does support that the UN peace operations have also contributed to regional peace, but I'm personally not entirely sure I'm not 100% sure I mean, I can never be 100% sure, but I'm not yet convinced if that's the case.
Suppose I have a follow-up question to Jeff's question, which is about the neutrality of UN peacekeeping operations or even regional peacekeeping operations, where the peacekeepers are coming from neighboring countries and are contributing in odd ways on the basis of their own country's national interests. So in my mind, I'm thinking of ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, and some of the countries from that region contributing to peacekeeping operations in the region. But then I'm also thinking about MONUSCO, Congo, where clearly you would not have Rwanda as a contributing peacekeeping country. But would UN be strong enough to refuse Rwanda if Rwanda had the temerity to ask? So I suppose that's another side of the same issue.
Yeah, true. Yeah, neutrality of UN peace operation. I think I'm not convinced that UN is so weak at like rejecting. I think there are enough offers and many. I mean, many. I have to count to say many, but at least multiple countries that are good at contributing troops and police have designed their security forces so that they actually continuously provide personnel. So they have a stake in continuously providing personnel. So I'm not too sure if UN is the bigger to accept all the offers. But yeah, of course they are on a asking side. So yeah, I don't know. there are examples, I know, there are examples of UN saying no to those troops that were engaged in a systematic sexual exploitation, abuse, or exploitation of natural resources, and that has happened. But the UN seems to need to have kind of a good reason not to take up an offer. So yeah, I think that is a possible problem. I mean, especially if it's a regional thing, regional risk and regional actors doing it under the name of the UN. Yeah, that might be
Any other questions online?
Yeah, what do you think the implications of the AU's increasing role in PK are?
okay. Okay, so there are several levels of thinking that I have. So I think on one side, it's probably good to have different actors to do this, and UN cannot do everything, and African problems can be understood by Africans more. All that positive things for having AU to do peace operations. On its own or under the name of the UN or with the funding of the UN. This is a new door that opened. On the operational side though, or at least at this stage, the accountability is quite difficult, especially because the UN and the AU do not have the same thinking, necessarily same thinking about certain things. For example, about the human rights standard or the internal discipline, conduct and discipline type of thing, or the mandate delivery type of accountability. It's not the same. So I think if the UN is involved in doing that, and I think there is an implication that UN need to have a clear agreement and to have a good follow-up on the sort of accountability side. Yeah, there are also implications for like budget. Okay, this is me just personally. I'm not so convinced about the UN giving money without much procedure to the AU, because I mean there are different organizations with different standards and different performance appraisal as well, different expectations, different rules of engagement, the different posture for peace operations as well. So I think the implication is that yes, it can be very positive, but it needs to be a little bit carefully planned, I guess. Yeah.
Any other questions around? Yes.
So in terms of, I saw the list of topics, and one was the climate emergency. And the question is, in terms of peacekeeping and climate emergency being such an all-encompassing topic involving so many sectors of society, what have you seen in terms of good practices or bad practices in how to incorporate that into the mandate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So bad practices, it's easy to start with, because I think the most famous one is a Nepalese troop in Haiti. For example, for giving, what is that?
Cholera?
Yeah, cholera to the state. But there is already okay, so and the next point I think is that member states are very worried about having environmental protection or climate emergency type peace operations mandate. They would not be, it would be difficult to convince them that this would be a part of a mandate, because the thinking is still that people are dying, we have to do it. So, and the environment, yes, and climate change, people do die and have their livelihood taken away, but member states don't see that so directly. They're also worried about expanding. So that's, I think, one thing. Good practice of environmental environment. I think we had one that talked about climate. We had one that was more about disaster response, but with the sort of involvement of environmental problems. I don't know if it's a good example, actually, good practice. And at the moment, I don't know if there is much appetite to further this practice. Which country would that? Because at the moment, everything is on the closing side. Cannot think of anything that is immediately applicable to the existing these operations. Yeah, I may need to think about it. I don't think I have an answer. Yeah.
Yeah, actually I have two questions. One that, yeah, maybe it's also in addition to what Matthew just said. And because when I saw the list of the mandated tasks or in general what's included in mandates, I had to think about this general criticism a lot of people bring up. And I think especially the military component, they're often very concerned and say, okay, this is like, it's impossible to achieve this and this is not what we can do. And this is also why so many people actually do perceive peace operations as failures, because we have these big goals, but it's impossible to achieve them. And I was wondering what your take is on that. Whether you believe it is actually important to have all these different mandated tasks that might even go as far as, I don't know, natural heritage management, or whether you believe it would make more sense to narrow it down to like these more traditional goals, and whether like that would also help to like increase the legitimacy of these operations. And the other question is very different and very specific. But I was wondering, because you work on accountability, right? And especially in the police context, and whether there is a difference between the formed police units and then also the individual police officers, because I mean, the structure is quite different, right? And how that's approached.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think for the mandate, my take is that it has to be tailored, it has to be prioritized. And some places you do need multidimensional missions, even though some, I mean, there's a lot of critique against multidimensional missions because of the recent events. But some places you do need it because that's the only way to be able to have any positive result, even if you are talking about negative peace, even if you are limited to negative peace. Traditional goals, I think, yeah, that might work for some places, and I think we need to think about the possibility of traditional type missions, because maybe some host states are not happy to get multi-dimensional missions, but maybe they are okay with traditional type monitoring missions. And it might be, you know, very tailored, it might be agreeable, you know, transparent, and maybe that's also something that we can look at. So I don't think it's one is better than the other, but the key is that let's not do multidimensional because that's what we do now, or stabilization that is very, you know, takes a lot of preparedness, and it's kind of high standard, high, how to say, you have to have willing states to do that, which is getting more and more difficult. For the police accountability, FPU and enforced police units are as if they are military, so they have a very similar accountability approach to like military, but they are still police, so like immunity and legal procedures are still with the police side. So they are a little bit sort of in a mix, in a middle of military and police. But both of them don't have any access to like appeal court. But once they, for example, if they do something, if they are dismissed or if they are caught for if they make a misconduct, commit a misconduct, and if they are disciplined. That's it, because they are not a staff, they don't have access to appeal. So there are multiple problems and difference. I think is the deployment model and the other thing is, like, if we're talking about mandate delivery type accountability, then it is a little bit different, because if you work as a unit and IPO work as an individual, so the accountability is also different according.
Any other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Thank you. I had some questions about the way in which the three principles get operationalized, especially in hard cases. I have lots of questions about that, but maybe just to focus on the third principle about the non-use of violence. And I'd say this is something I only know about by following news coverage, so forgive my ignorance. But there are these situations one hears about where you've got peacekeepers on the ground, and they're present, and they are either witnessing human rights abuses or violence, or it's clear that human rights abuses are imminent, and there they are. So I guess, what are the rules of engagement? What are they meant to do in that situation? Because one can imagine the way that kind of situation can lead to a massive degradation of trust, which you really persuading us was so central here. But also, you mentioned something almost in passing, that the principle of the non-use of violence, there's an exception for self-defense, but then you also mentioned in some cases for the protection of third parties.
Yeah.
So how does that all work?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a big question, I know.
No, but that's a good question. So for no use of force, so the starting point is, yes, you are right that the peacekeepers are not to use force unless it's for self-defense or for themselves or their colleagues, and then it became mandate, so they can use force to protect their, for example, mission headquarters or vehicles, or and then now it's we still say it's a principle, but when we are talking about, for example, protection of civilians, they are depending on the mission, when they have a chapter 7 mission to use all means, what is a means possible, all available means, they can, well, actually, that's one thing. Protection mandate, they can use force to protect civilians in the area that they deploy within the limit of resources. They can use force to protect people, and even like in Congo, I think the famous one is a forced intervention brigade. That they said it's an exception, but they authorized the peacekeepers to go after the peace spoilers, to actually go on offense, not defense. So to me, it's a warring party. I mean, they use force to fight against the conflict party. It seems that it's a little bit, I don't find it very easy to understand how this non-use of force is still applicable. The UN is trying to go back to non-use of force, at least not to go on a stabilization or to use forced intervention brigade type intervention anymore, mainly or largely because of member states not willing to. And that's the continuous problem, because, like, for example, in was it Rwandan force? Anyway, it continues to happen that some of the troops that are deployed to protect civilians refuse to do so when it's too dangerous. They would,
South Sudan.
South Sudan, there was a Chinese battalion that didn't do that for protection of civilians from sexual violence. Actually, it's not even civilian, but it's an international staff working in humanitarian affairs. The Chinese just sort of withdrew, but there was another one in the Rwandan troop, I think, put out. So yeah, it's continuously problematic. So I think UN is trying to go back to not having to put those troops into that place. But then the question comes back to then who does it? African Union is much more prepared to do that. So is it then AU that will do it? So I think there is a lot of problems and dilemmas there. Yeah, what was it? And I think that's answer the question. Defense mandate. Yeah. So in a mandate, it's not only just self-defense, but uses force for other things.
Thank you. Maybe one final question. And that is just to note that Francisca over here and me are working on a project on sexual exploitation and abuse, which involves peacekeepers, but also other actors within the UN system. And it focuses on the UN's internal justice mechanisms.
Oh, okay.
So basically, it's all about employment dismissal, the individuals who are appealing the dismissals that they're getting for committing sexual exploitation and abuse. And what we've found so far is it's really quite interesting, I would say, the study. The judges are really all over the place. And it's just an open question whether that's something you've come across, whether you know of any research in this area, because in a way, we haven't really come across any others who are working on this issue.
Okay, I haven't done it for sexual exploitation abuse. I've done it, but
The internal justice mechanism.
internal justice mechanism for crimes for UN police. So that's very limited to UN police. But not solely looking at the internal justice system, but basically following what happens if there is a crime, allegation of crime in a peace operation. What happens? Who takes complaints and who gets the information and where does it go and what happens after dismissal? And sometimes it happens in host state. Well, not very much, but there are cases where host state prosecuted those people. Most of the time it's the sending state, the contributing state, and then in the internal mechanism, what I looked at was what is that called, the commission that looks at it internally.
OIOS.
Yeah, OIOS and previous one to see what kind. Actually, I had access. And it's a legitimate access because it was public, but I think it's a leak. I had access to the Commission of Inquiry is what I was getting at. Commission of Inquiry files from certain period to certain period. And it was shocking. I think it was a public document, so I can share it with you. It was shocking. The quality was so shocking. I mean, it's some time ago, so I'm sure it's improved. But for example, one of the things was somebody hit this person on a street at 10 kilometers per hour, and this person flew 200 meters away. And this is an approved report of the Commission of Inquiry. And you cannot fly 200 meters by being hit by a car on 10 kilometers per hour. My point is that the quality of those files were just so appalling that there was really scary. And then I followed up only until OIOS, how they deal with it and what kind of documents they have, and CDS, CDU at the time, but CDS, so that kind of internal mechanism, not court, but maybe you are looking at
The
tribunals, I only followed the cases that tried to get there, like 2 cases that UNPOL tried to file a case. They said, no, UNPOL is not, we cannot look at your case because you are not the staff. And that was it. So that's the extent that
I think we have.
I think somebody wants to ask a question.
Okay,
And then I'll
this is
to
the
talk.
final question. Maria, I think you're you're on. You can unmute.
Hello, yes, my name is Maria Kurina. I am from Fight for Right Ukrainian OPD organization and alumna of Essex Human Rights School. I would like to ask a question regarding the situation in the international military conflict in Ukraine. Due to the situation that in the Security Council, UN Security Council, Russia or China will predominantly block any decisions regarding any peace operations in Ukraine. And this situation kind of decides the destiny of such operation before it even this discussion starts. What would you comment about this? What are your thoughts of this situation that actually discriminates Ukraine, because Ukraine participated in the Balkan conflicts as a peace corps and in Africa, on the African continent themselves? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think I purposefully not talk about Ukraine and Gaza because we did think a lot about possibilities, and of course the first hurdle is the Security Council. One thing we thought about, I thought about, is well, okay, there are a few things. One is that if Security Council is not working, is there any other path to get something that you want without calling it peace operations? So that's one. Because actually a lot of, for example, I worked in OHR in Nepal, and we were doing like human rights monitoring and peace agreement monitoring, and everything else, human rights, capacity building, and collection of information. I would not call it investigation, but collection of information so that those crimes and human rights violations can be dealt with later on. Peace operations does some of it, if peace operations can happen, but OHR did it at the time. So I think there are different paths that might be possible. But the other thing we thought about is the peace operations do not have to be Christmas tree mandates. So if it is very, very specific, I don't think it will happen for justice. But if it is, for example, just mine risk education or something that is very limited, which is not so controversial for those countries that do not authorize peace operations. That may happen. I know that that's not what you are looking for, but my point is that peace operations as such may not be completely impossible if we think about it in a wide range of peace operations mandate. I think, yeah, that's probably two I can think of. I mean, of course, there is probably other ways going for even if it's UN, going for special political mission, which does a lot of investigatory type operations presence. Yeah, commission of inquiry type of thing. Maybe.
And that would not have to be authorized by Chapter 7.
Right.
And so there would be no veto.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our time. This has been really exciting and really interesting. So thank you so much. We wish we could have you here more often, not only once every 10 years or so. So please join me in thanking our guest, Professor Kihara-Hunt. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.